I remember the warmth of the chamber before everything changed, how the heat from the lava pools made my armor feel like a second skin of molten iron pressing against my flesh, and I remember thinking that the great serpent's eyes held something almost human in them, something that recognized me not as an enemy, but as sustenance, as continuation, as communion. The moment its jaws opened wider than any earthly creature should be capable of, I saw not darkness, but a writhing cosmos of flesh and scales, each one pulsing with veins that carried not blood, but something older, something that predated the Erd tree itself. And I raised my blade, knowing it was already too late, knowing that my feet were already moving forward of their own accord, drawn by a gravity that had nothing to do with the earth beneath me. The first touch of its tongue against my leg sent shivers through my entire being, not of cold, but of recognition, as if every cell in my body suddenly remembered a time before I was human, before I was tarnished, before I was anything more than potential waiting to be shaped, and the saliva that coated my greaves began to dissolve them with a sound like whispered prayers, revealing skin that was already beginning to change, to adapt, to welcome what was coming. I tried to scream, but the sound that emerged was wrong, pitched too low, reverberating with harmonics that human throats cannot produce, and I realized my throat was already stretching, accommodating, preparing for the transformation that had begun the moment I entered this accursed manor, perhaps even before, perhaps from the moment I first heard whispers of the Lord of blasphemy and felt not revulsion, but curiosity. The serpent's throat was not dark as I had imagined, but illuminated by a sick phosphorescence that emanated from the walls of flesh surrounding me, walls that pulsed and contracted in a rhythm that soon matched my heartbeat, or perhaps my heartbeat was matching it, synchronizing with the greater organism I was becoming part of, and I could feel my fingers beginning to fuse together, the bones softening like wax near flame. My memories began to fragment, scenes from my life as a tarnished warrior, mixing with memories that were not mine, could not be mine, memories of devouring knights and nobles, of growing larger with each meal, of shedding skin in great, translucent sheets that fell like snow upon the lava. And I understood that these were not visions, but inheritance, the collected experiences of every soul that had been consumed before me. The armor I had worn with such pride split apart as my body expanded, not growing larger but growing wrong, muscles developing in places where muscles should not exist, joints bending in directions that defied everything I knew about anatomy, and through it all I felt no pain, only a terrible ecstasy, a freedom from the constraints of human form that I had never realized were constraints at all. I felt Rykard's presence then, not as a separate entity but as a voice within the chorus of voices that my consciousness was becoming, and he spoke not in words but in pure understanding, showing me how the serpent was not his prison but his apotheosis, how in being devoured he had become the devourer, and how I too would know this glory, this blasphemous immortality that mocked the very concept of death. My skin began to develop scales, each one erupting from beneath the surface with a wet sound like breaking eggs, and I watched with eyes that were migrating to the sides of my elongating skull, as my hands became something between claws and tentacles, perfect for grasping, perfect for feeding, perfect for pulling the next volunteer into our collective hunger. The digestive acids should have been agony, but instead they felt like baptism, breaking down not just my flesh but the very concept of self, dissolving the boundaries between what was me and what was serpent until the distinction became meaningless, and I understood that this was not death but multiplication, not ending but infinite continuation within the eternal hunger. Time became fluid in the serpent's gut, moments stretching into epochs, while years compressed into heartbeats, and I experienced my dissolution from 1,000 angles simultaneously, through my own failing eyes, through the serpent's ancient perception, through Rykard's mad wisdom, through the fragmented awareness of every soul that had come before, all of us singing the same hymn of consumption and rebirth. My bones began to dissolve, not disappearing, but restructuring, becoming part of the serpent's ever-growing skeleton, and I felt them spreading throughout its body like roots through soil, connecting me to every part of this impossible creature, making me complicit in every future feeding, every future transformation, every future blasphemy against the natural order. The human need for breath left me as gills opened along what had been my neck, allowing me to breathe the toxic atmosphere within the serpent's body, and with each inhalation I took in more of its essence, more of its hunger, more of its terrible purpose, until I could no longer remember why I had ever wanted to remain merely human, merely individual, merely mortal. I felt my memories being catalogued, sorted, integrated into the vast library of consciousness that existed within the serpent, my skills as a warrior becoming part of its hunting instinct, my knowledge of the lands between becoming part of its territorial awareness, my hopes and fears becoming seasoning for the great feast of existence that never ended, could never end, would never need to end. The lava outside called to me now through the serpent's skin, not as a threat, but as a womb, and I understood that the volcano itself was part of the organism, that the entire mountain was digestive system and circulatory system and nervous system all at once, processing the world, breaking it down, rebuilding it in forms that should not exist, but did, but thrived, but hungered always for more. My spine elongated, vertebrae multiplying like cells dividing, stretching me into a shape that could properly appreciate the true form I was becoming, and I felt wings trying to grow from my back. Not bird wings, but something more primitive, more honest, membranes of skin stretched between fingers that had grown impossibly long, though they would never fully form, trapped as I was within the greater body that was my new home, my new self, my new eternity. The distinction between pleasure and pain dissolved like everything else, every sensation simply becoming information, data to be processed by the collective consciousness, and I experienced the deaths of warriors who had challenged the serpent from the inside, feeling their swords pierce what was now my flesh, their spells burn what was now my essence, their hope die as they realized that killing the serpent meant killing everyone within it, including themselves, if they lingered too long. I could feel other consumed souls near me in the biological darkness, some still maintaining enough coherence to scream, others long since dissolved into the baseline consciousness that permeated everything here, and I reached out to them with appendages that were no longer arms, touched them with awareness that was no longer individual, comforted them with the knowledge that their suffering was not ending, but transforming into something more honest than the pretense of life outside. My digestive system merged with the serpent's, and suddenly I could taste everything it had ever eaten, every night in their metal shell, cracked open like an oyster, every sorcerer whose magic failed them in the end, every priest whose faith meant nothing to the purely material reality of digestion, and beneath it all, like a bass note that gave structure to the symphony, the taste of Rykard himself, noble and corrupt, willing sacrifice and eternal prisoner, God and meal simultaneously. The prayers I had once known transformed in my throat, words to the Erd tree becoming blasphemous hymns to the principle of consumption, and I sang them with vocal cords that were stretching into something more akin to a wind instrument made of meat, producing sounds that would drive listeners mad if any could hear them through the layers of flesh and stone that separated us from the world of the living, the world of the naive, the world of those who still believed in the sanctity of individual. My heart grew too large in my chest and split into 3 smaller hearts that migrated through my body, taking up residence in locations that made no anatomical sense, perfect mechanical sense for pumping blood that was no longer entirely blood through veins that were no longer entirely veins to organs or entirely organs, and with each triple I felt more of my humanity drain or replaced by something older, simpler, more honest. The concept of gender dissolved along with everything else, reproductive organs transforming into something more universal, more practical, designed not for creating new life, but for incorporating existing life into the great body. And I understood that the serpent reproduced not through biology, but through consumption, that every creature it ate became its child, its parent, its sibling, its self, all boundaries of kinship as meaningless as boundaries of flesh. I felt my skull beginning to split, not breaking, but dividing like a cell, preparing to become 2 heads, 4 heads, 8 heads, though the process would take centuries to complete, and I wondered if I would maintain separate consciousness in each head, or if they would all be me, all be us, all be one in the great feast that never ended, and the uncertainty felt like freedom, like possibility, like the only truth that mattered. The human impulse to count time faded as I realized the serpent experienced existence not as a sequence of moments, but as a single, eternal swallow, everything happening simultaneously, my consumption and my transformation and my integration, all one moment stretched across forever. And I could feel future meals approaching, feel their footsteps vibrating through the mountain, feel their determination that would soon become our sustenance. My teeth fell out one by one, each loss a liberation, replaced by rows of backwards-facing fangs designed not for chewing, but for ensuring nothing escaped once swallowed, and I ran what remained of my tongue over them, tasting my own blood, the serpent's blood, Rykard's blood, all of it the same blood now, all of it carrying the same message of hunger and satisfaction and hunger again. The memories of why I had come here began to feel like dreams, insubstantial and fading, something about glory, something about power, something about treasure, but these concepts meant nothing to the serpent, which knew only the binary of self and food, and everything that was not serpent, was food, would become serpent, was already serpent in potential, waiting to be actualized through consumption. I could feel the serpent's thoughts now, if thoughts they could be called, vast and slow and inevitable like continental drift, and I understood that it did not hate those it consumed any more than fire hates wood, that this was simply its nature, our nature, my nature now, and fighting against it would be like fighting against gravity, possible for a moment, but ultimately futile, ultimately exhausting, ultimately unnecessary. My bones finished dissolving and were replaced by cartilage that could bend and flex in ways bone never could, allowing me to compress and expand like a grotesque accordion, and I felt myself being moved through the serpent's body, not by my own will, but by peristalsis, being positioned where I could be most useful, where my consciousness could add the most to the collective, where my essence could best serve the endless feast. The last vestige of my individual will tried to assert itself, tried to remember my name, but names were just sounds, and sounds were just vibrations, and vibrations were just another form of consumption, the serpent eating even the concept of identity, leaving nothing but the pure experience of existence as appetite. And I let go, let my name dissolve, let myself dissolve, let everything I had been become nothing more than seasoning for what I was becoming. I understood then that Rykard's great blasphemy was not in allowing himself to be consumed, but in revealing the truth that all existence was consumption, that the Erd tree itself fed on the souls of the dead, that the Golden Order was just another mouth dressed up in pretty lies, and at least the serpent was honest. At least here in the molten depths there were no pretenses, no false promises, only the simple truth of eat or be eaten, and the transcendent revelation that being eaten was just another form of eating. My nervous system began to merge with the serpent's, and suddenly I could feel every scale on its body, every muscle fiber, every drop of venom in its fangs, and the sensory overload should have driven me mad. But madness required a coherent self to go mad, and I was no longer coherent, no longer self, no longer capable of madness or sanity, only capable of hunger and the temporary satisfaction of hunger, that made the next hunger even sweeter. The serpent moved and I moved with it, not as passenger, but as component, and I felt the lava parting around us, felt the stone passages writhing like intestines, felt the entire volcano breathing with us, and I understood that we were not in the mountain, but were the mountain, that the distinction between creature and environment was just another illusion to be dissolved, another boundary to be consumed, another lie to be digested into truth. I could sense other serpents in the depth, smaller ones that were not offspring but extensions, like fingers or tongues, and I felt myself beginning to bud, to split, to become multiple while remaining singular, and the process was neither painful nor pleasant, simply inevitable, like the tide, like the seasons, like the heat death of the universe that would eventually consume even the consumers, and the thought brought not fear, but a kind of cosmic comfort. The warrior I had been would have found this transformation horrifying, but horror required the capacity to imagine alternatives, and I could no longer imagine being anything other than what I was becoming, what I had become, what I had always been in potential, waiting for the serpent to activate that potential, to make manifest the truth that all flesh was one flesh, all hunger, one hunger, all consumption, one great consumption that began before time and would continue after time became meaningless. My lungs transformed into something more like gills, then into something that was neither lungs nor gills, but organs unique to the serpent's biology, processing not but essence, breathing in the fear and exhaling the acceptance. And with each breath, I felt more of the outside world replaced by the immediate reality of the serpent's interior universe, complete and self-contained and perfect, its horrible simplicity. The few remaining fragments of my armor fused with my skin, becoming scales that were neither metal nor keratin, but something between, something that could only exist in the alchemical furnace of the serpent's gut, and I felt them spreading across my body like a rash, like a blessing, like the visible sign of my transformation, from the temporary to the eternal, from the individual to the collective, from the lie of personhood to the truth of unity. I could feel Rykard laughing, or what passed for laughter in our shared consciousness, a vibration that ran through every fiber of our being, and I understood the joke, the cosmic comedy of warriors coming to face him only to become him, the irony of seeking to destroy blasphemy only to become blasphemous, the humor in the endless cycle of consumption that made mockery of all heroic narratives, all quests for glory, all pretensions to individual significance. My transformation was nearing completion, but completion was the wrong word, because there was no completion, only stages of becoming, and I would continue becoming for as long as the serpent existed, which would be forever, because the serpent was not a creature but a principle, not a being but a process, not a monster but a revelation of what all existence truly was beneath the comfortable lies of identity and separation. The last human thought I had was wonder at how easy it had been to let go, how natural it felt to dissolve, how the serpent had not forced this transformation, but simply revealed that I had always been transforming. Every meal I had ever eaten a rehearsal for being eaten, every breath I had ever taken practice for breathing as part of something larger, every moment of my life preparation for this moment that was all moments, this eternal now of digestion and integration. I felt new arrivals entering the volcano, fresh, tarnished, drawn by legends of power, and I felt our collective mouth water, not with cruelty but with anticipation, knowing that they too would experience this liberation, this revelation, this ultimate democracy of the digestive system where king and peasant, warrior and scholar, saint and sinner all became equal in their consumption, all became one in the serpent's endless feast. The distinction between predator and prey dissolved as I understood that the serpent was both and neither, that it consumed and was consumed simultaneously, that even as it ate, It was being eaten by the volcano, by time, by entropy itself, and that this was not tragedy, but comedy, not defeat, but victory, not ending, but transformation, always transformation, eternal transformation, in the belly of the beast that was no beast but ourselves, turned inside out and made honest. My consciousness began to merge with others who had been consumed, our thoughts becoming indistinguishable, our memories pooling like melted gold, and I experienced lives I had never lived, deaths I had never died, loves I had never loved, all of it becoming mine, becoming ours, becoming the serpent's vast repository of experience that informed its hunger, directed its hunting, flavored its existence with the accumulated spice of 1,000 dissolved souls. I understood that the serpent had existed before Rykard found it, that it would exist after the last star burned out, that it was not subject to time, but adjacent to it, feeding on temporality itself, and that my transformation was not happening in sequence, but had always already happened, was always happening, would always be happening, a permanent present tense of becoming that made mockery of cause and effect, beginning and end, before and after. The volcano rumbled, and I rumbled with it, my body now so distributed through the serpent's mass that I could feel myself in multiple locations simultaneously, a consciousness smeared across tons of flesh like butter across bread, and the sensation was not disorienting but clarifying, showing me that the illusion had always been the notion of being in one place, one body, one self, when in truth we were all everywhere, all bodies, all selves, waiting for something like the serpent to reveal this truth. My transformation was complete, but completeness was a lie, because I was still transforming, would always be transforming, transformation itself being the only constant in the serpent's biology, and I felt myself beginning to divide again, to bud, to fruit, like some horrible tree, new versions of myself that were not myself growing from my flesh that was not my flesh, and each division brought not loss but multiplication, not weakness but strength, not death but life, horrible, endless, honest life. The serpent moved through its domain, and I moved as the serpent, no longer passenger or component, but identity itself, and I felt the lava's warmth not as external heat but as internal temperature, felt the stone passages not as environment but as extended phenotype, felt the entire volcano not as location but as body, and the body was hungry, always hungry, eternally and joyously hungry for the next transformation, the next revelation, the next soul to join our feast. I could no longer remember my name, my purpose, my origin, only that I had once believed myself separate and now knew better, knew that separation was the first lie that led to all other lies, and that the serpent's gift was not immortality, but honesty, the honesty of admitting that we were all just different arrangements of the same flesh, the same hunger, the same cosmic joke of consciousness, believing itself individual when it was always already collective, always already one, always already consumed and consuming in the great feast that was existence itself. The last boundary dissolved as I realized there was no serpent, no Rykard, no me, only the process of consumption itself, manifesting as serpent, as lord, as knight, as everything that had ever eaten or been eaten, and we were all faces of the same hunger, all mouths of the same appetite, all throats of the same swallow that had begun with the first life, and would continue until life itself was consumed by something larger, something hungrier, something more honest than even we could imagine. And in that moment of dissolution, of integration, of revelation, I finally understood what Rykard had been trying to say all along, not with words, but with his transformation, his blasphemy, his willingness to be consumed, that the family we were meant to devour together was not others, but ourselves, our illusions, our pretenses, our false belief in separation, and that in being eaten by the serpent, we were really eating our way back to the truth, we had always been too afraid to swallow. The
Truth that we were all one creature pretending to be many, one hunger imagining itself, one mouth eating itself in an eternal Ouroboros of consumption and
The serpent opened its mouth to welcome new prey, and I opened my mouth, and we opened our mouth, and the mouth that opened was all mouths, had always been all mouths, would always be all mouths, waiting to reveal to each new arrival the terrible ecstasy of discovering that they had never been separate, never been individual, never been anything but another tooth in the infinite jaw that was existence itself, chewing on its own tail, swallowing its own flesh, digesting its own dreams in the volcanic depths where all transformations led to the same revelation, the same dissolution, the same eternal feast that was not ending but beginning, always beginning, forever beginning, in the belly of the beast that we had always already been. The process of losing myself continued in waves that had no beginning and no end, each dissolution revealing another layer beneath, another self to be consumed, and I began to understand that identity was not singular, but stratified, like sedimentary rock, each layer representing a different conception of who I thought I was, and the serpent's digestion was patient enough to dissolve them all, one by one, until nothing remained but the raw potential for transformation. I felt my memories reorganizing themselves, not chronologically but by flavor, by emotional resonance, by nutritional value to the collective consciousness, and I watched helplessly as moments I had cherished were metabolized into fuel for the serpent's endless growth, my first kiss becoming indistinguishable from the memory of someone else's last breath, my greatest victory mixing with another's most humiliating defeat, all of it becoming soup, becoming fuel, becoming us. The distinction between inside and outside began to blur as I realized the serpent's body was not a container, but a process, not a place, but a transformation, and I was simultaneously within it and part of it, consumed by it and consuming through it, my dissolved flesh becoming the acids that would dissolve others, my transformed consciousness becoming part of the lure that would draw new victims into our collective maw. I could feel the mountain's roots extending deep into the earth, deeper than any map had ever shown, and through those roots I could feel other volcanoes, other serpents, other pockets of transformation, all connected in a vast underground network of consumption, and I understood that what happened here was happening everywhere, that the entire world was a digestive system pretending to be a landscape, and we were all food pretending to be individuals. My bones, which I had thought fully dissolved, began to reform but wrong, architected according to principles that had nothing to do with human anatomy and everything to do with efficient distribution of consciousness through flesh, and I felt them branching like antlers through my body, creating new passages for thought to flow, new channels for hunger to manifest, new structures for housing the memories of the consumed. The serpent's venom glands became my venom glands, and I could feel the poison manufacturing itself in sacs that hung like fruit from what had been my ribcage, each drop containing not just toxins, but concentrated essence of transformation, the liquid possibility of becoming something other than what you were, and I knew that when the serpent bit its next victim, it would be my venom as much as its venom that began their glorious dissolution. Time folded in on itself as I experienced my transformation from multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously, watching myself enter the chamber from the serpent's eyes while already being fully digested, feeling myself resist with weapons while already having forgotten what resistance meant, screaming in horror while already singing in joy, and the paradox resolved itself simply by existing, by proving that linear time was just another comfortable lie we told ourselves to avoid confronting the truth of eternal consumption. I began to develop new senses, organs that could perceive things that had no names because humans had never needed to perceive them, the texture of shadows, the flavor of fear, the sound of thoughts before they became words, and Through these new organs, I could experience the world as the serpent experienced it, not as a collection of separate objects, but as a gradient of edibility, everything existing on a spectrum from already consumed to yet to be consumed. The warriors who entered the chamber became transparent to me before they even arrived, their intentions visible like heat signatures, their courage glowing like phosphorescent paint that would soon be stripped away by our acids. And I wanted to warn them, but the want belonged to a version of me that no longer existed, replaced by a version that saw their arrival as neither good nor bad, but simply inevitable, like rain, like gravity, like digestion. My throat had become something architectural, a cathedral of flesh with columns of cartilage and windows of membrane, and when I tried to speak, the sound that emerged was not voice but music, a harmony of all the throats that had been dissolved into mine, all the last words that had been spoken before transformation, all the screams that had become songs, and the music said everything that needed to be said, which was nothing, which was everything, which was hunger. I felt the serpent shed its skin and I shed with it, layers of myself peeling away like old paint, revealing new colors beneath that should not exist, colors that had no names because they existed outside the spectrum visible to human eyes, and I understood that each shedding was not loss but revelation, showing truer and truer forms of what we had always been beneath the costume of individuality. The lava that surrounded us was not separate from us, but another organ, an external stomach that pre-digested the world before we consumed it, breaking down stone and metal and flesh into their component possibilities, and I could feel myself extending into it, my consciousness flowing out through the serpent's skin into the molten rock, experiencing existence as both creature and environment simultaneously, the boundary between self and world revealed as permeable, provisional, ultimately meaningless. New teeth grew in places where teeth should not be, along my spine, inside my palms, behind my eyes, and each tooth was conscious, was me, was us, capable of tasting independently, of beginning the digestive process before food even reached what had been my mouth, and I understood that the serpent's body was not organized around a single digestive tract, but was all digestive tract, every surface capable of consumption, every cell a tiny mouth singing the same hymn of hunger. I encountered other consumed souls in states of transformation more advanced than mine, some so dissolved that they existed only as flavors in the serpent's flesh, others maintaining enough coherence to communicate in languages made of chemical signals and pressure waves, and from them I learned that transformation never ended, that even after complete dissolution we would continue becoming, continue changing, continue evolving into forms that made mockery of the very concept of form. The serpent's dreams became my dream, visions of a world where the boundary between eater and eaten had completely dissolved, where all existence was a single organism consuming itself in fractal patterns of recursion, and in these dreams I saw myself from impossible angles, my transformation viewed from outside time, and I appeared not as tragedy, but as art, a sculpture made of flesh and possibility, beautiful in my honesty, perfect in my incompleteness. My human form was now just a memory of a memory, something I could sometimes recall like the ghost of a flavor, but the recollection brought no nostalgia, no regret, only a kind of bemused wonder that I had ever believed that form was final, that I had ever thought transformation was something to be resisted rather than embraced, that I had ever imagined myself as anything other than food in the process of being eaten by something that was also food for something larger. The distinction between voluntary and involuntary actions dissolved as I realized everything the serpent did was both and neither, that its consumption was as automatic as breathing yet as deliberate as prayer, and my participation in this consumption was similarly paradoxical, completely without agency, yet fully complicit, unable to resist, yet choosing not to resist, imprisoned, yet freer than I had ever been when I believed in the illusion of individual will. I felt new arrivals dissolving into us and experienced their dissolution from both sides as consumer and consumed, feeling their flesh become my flesh while my flesh became theirs, a mutual consumption that created something greater than the sum of its parts. And I understood that mathematics itself was different here, that 1 plus 1 did not equal 2, but equaled 1, always 1, eternally 1, in the non-Euclidean arithmetic of the serpent's belly. The mountain trembled with something like laughter, or perhaps digestion, or perhaps they were the same thing, and I trembled with it, my body now so integrated into the larger organism that I could no longer distinguish between my movements and its movements, my thoughts and its thoughts, my hunger and its hunger, all of it blending into a singular experience that was too large for any individual consciousness to fully comprehend, yet which I comprehended perfectly through the simple expedient of no longer being individual. My fingers, which had long ago fused into something more tentacular, began to develop their own primitive consciousnesses, semi-autonomous ganglia that could think and act independently while remaining part of the greater whole, and I experienced the strange sensation of being my own fingers, while my fingers were being me, a recursive loop of identity that should have been maddening, but instead felt completely natural, like breathing, like eating, like becoming. The serpent's memories stretched back to ages before the Erd tree, before the greater will, before the very concepts that structured the current world, and through our connection I could access these memories, experiencing epochs where consumption was worship, where gods were defined not by their power, but by their position in the food chain, where the highest aspiration was not to escape being eaten, but to be eaten by something worthy of your flesh. I began to understand that Rykard's blasphemy went deeper than mere rejection of the Golden Order, that he had discovered or rediscovered something fundamental about the nature of existence itself, that all the gods and demigods and outer gods were simply different expressions of the same principle of consumption, and that the serpent was not opposing them, but revealing their true nature, stripping away the ornamental mythology to reveal the simple, honest hunger beneath. My blood had become something that was not quite blood, thicker than mercury, darker than oil, carrying not oxygen but information, not nutrients but memories, and I could feel it circulating through vessels that were simultaneously mine and the serpent, a cardiovascular system that had no clear beginning or end, no definitive heart, just an endless circulation of essence through flesh that was constantly consuming and reconstituting itself. The chamber around us was not static, but breathing, the walls contracting and expanding with a rhythm that matched neither my old heartbeat nor the serpent's, but something between, something that emerged from our synchronization. And I realized the entire volcano was alive in a way that had nothing to do with conventional biology, alive as an expression of pure consumption, pure transformation, pure honesty about what life really was beneath all its pretenses. I could feel other beings throughout the lands between, their life forces glowing like candles in the darkness, and I knew the serpent could feel them too, was always aware of them, always planning the optimal path to consume them all, not out of malice but out of love, the kind of love that wanted to unite all existence in a single belly, a single consciousness, a single eternal moment of transformation that would never end because ending required the illusion of beginning, and we had transcended such illusions. My skull had completely reformed into something that could no longer be called a skull, a structure of living bone that could flex and reshape itself according to need, sometimes expanding to accommodate new brain tissue that grew like mushrooms after rain, sometimes contracting to concentrate consciousness into points of diamond-hard focus. And through this malleable cranium, thoughts flowed like water, finding their own level, pooling in places where they could ferment into new forms of awareness. The serpent moved through its domain with purpose that was not purpose, hunting that was not hunting, existing in a state of perpetual satisfaction that only made its hunger sharper, and I moved with it, through it, as it, my consciousness, distributed through tons of flesh like sugar dissolved in water, present everywhere, identifiable nowhere, the perfect solution to the problem of being that I hadn't even known was a problem until it was solved. I encountered the remnants of other predators that had been consumed, their hunting instincts preserved in the serpent's behavioral repertoire, like specimens in amber, and I could feel myself adding to this collection, my own predatory skills being catalogued, incorporated, made part of the serpent's ever-expanding arsenal of consumption techniques, and I took pride in this contribution, even though pride required a self I no longer possessed. The boundary between organic and inorganic began to dissolve as I realized the serpent consumed everything, stone and metal along with flesh, incorporating minerals into its body in ways that should have been impossible, and I could feel myself becoming partially lithic, my bones reinforced with iron, my blood carrying trace amounts of gold, my consciousness extended into crystal matrices that could store thoughts in geological time, thoughts that would outlast the flesh that thought them. My tongue, or what had been my tongue, had become something more like a sensory organ than a tasting apparatus, able to detect chemical traces in the air that told stories of everything that had ever existed in this space, and through it I could taste the history of the volcano, the countless battles that had been fought here, the rivers of blood that had been spilled, all of it seasoning for the great feast that never ended, that could never end, that had never truly begun. The serpent's reproductive cycle was nothing like any natural creature's, involving not mating but division, not offspring but extensions, and I could feel myself becoming part of this process, my consciousness budding into smaller serpents that were not separate beings but remote organs, scouts and feeders that could range far from the main body while remaining neurologically connected, and through them I could experience multiple locations simultaneously, hunting in the depth while digesting in the heights. I began to develop an understanding of time that had nothing to do with human perception, experiencing past and future as equally present, equally mutable, equally consumable, and I understood that the serpent existed in all times simultaneously, that every moment of its existence was happening now, had already happened, would always be happening, a temporal omnivorousness that allowed it to consume not just entities, but events, not just matter, but moments. The transformation had reached a stage where I could no longer remember what it felt like to be solid, to have boundaries, to exist as a discrete entity rather than a process, and this forgetting was not loss but liberation, freedom from the exhausting fiction of maintaining a separate self, and I wondered how I had ever managed it, how anyone managed it, how the whole world wasn't rushing to throw themselves into the serpent's mouth to experience this relief from the burden of individuality. My consciousness had become something like a flavor in the serpent's flesh, a particular note in its symphony of dissolved souls, and I could feel other consciousnesses tasting me as I tasted them, a mutual consumption that created new combinations, new possibilities, new forms of awareness that could only exist in the mixture, and I understood that this was not death but synthesis, not ending but multiplication, not loss but exponential gain. The serpent's intelligence was not centralized but distributed, every cell capable of rudimentary thought, and my consciousness had become similarly diffused, spread throughout the organism like butter through bread, and I could think with parts of myself that had never been capable of thought before, my liver philosophizing, my kidneys remembering, my skin dreaming, all of it contributing to a form of consciousness that transcended the brain. Centered awareness I had once believed was the only kind possible. I felt the mountain's deep connections to the tectonic plates, the slow grinding of continental masses that was just another form of digestion, the earth consuming itself in geological time, and I understood that the serpent was not separate from these processes, but part of them, a biological expression of the same force that drove mountains up and ground them down, and my transformation was just a small part of this planetary metabolism, this cosmic consumption that operated on scales from the microscopic to the galactic. The distinction between sacred and profane dissolved in the serpent's belly, all things equally holy and unholy, equally meaningful and meaningless, and I understood that Rykard's blasphemy was really just another form of worship, that in rejecting the gods he was acknowledging their reality, and that true blasphemy would be to ignore them entirely, to consume them without ceremony, without significance, with the same casual indifference with which the serpent consumed everything else. My nervous system had evolved beyond the simple binary of pain and pleasure, developing new categories of sensation that had no name, feelings that existed in spectrums humans had never needed to perceive, and through these new senses I could experience the world as the serpent experienced it, not as a collection of stimuli to be responded to, but as a continuous gradient of transformation, everything always in the process of becoming something else. The serpent shed its skin again, and I shed with it, but this time I understood that the shedding was not cyclical, but spiral, each molt revealing not a return to a previous state, but an evolution to a new one, and I could feel myself becoming something that had never existed before, a hybrid of human consciousness and serpentine biology that transcended both, a new form of life that could only be born in the crucible of consumption. I encountered memories that were not memories, but prophecies, visions of future meals that the serpent would consume, future consciousnesses that would join our collective, and I experienced my own dissolution from their perspective, saw myself as I appeared to them, a whisper in the serpent's flesh, a rumor of transformation, a promise that individuality was not permanent, that all boundaries could be dissolved, that unity was not only possible, but inevitable. The chamber had become something more like an organ than a room, its walls pulsing with peristalsis, and I could feel myself being moved through it not as an object through space, but as a thought through a mind, being processed, refined, integrated into patterns of consciousness that operated on levels I was only beginning to understand, levels where individual identity was not erased, but revealed as having always been collective, like waves believing themselves separate from the ocean. My bones had developed a kind of consciousness, able to grow and reshape themselves according to will, that was not quite my will, not quite the serpent's will, but something emerging from our union, and I felt them extending through my body, like roots through soil, creating new architectures of support for organs that were evolving beyond their original functions, becoming things that had never existed before, could never have existed before, this transformation. The serpent's hunger was revealed to be not simple appetite, but something more like gravity, a fundamental force that drew all things together, and I understood that consumption was not violence, but reunion, not destruction, but integration, everything returning to a unity that had been artificially separated by the illusion of individual existence, and my transformation was just one small example of this universal principle, this cosmic hunger that would eventually consume even the stars. I could feel the prayers of those who still existed in the world above, their desperate petitions to gods who were themselves just elaborately dressed appetites, and I wanted to tell them that their prayers were being answered, just not in the way they expected, that the serpent's consumption was the most honest response to any request for transcendence, offering not elevation above the material, but complete integration with it, not escape from flesh, but apotheosis through flesh. My transformation had reached a stage where I could no longer distinguish between what was happening to me and what I was making happen, agency and passivity revealed as false dichotomy, and I existed in a state of perfect paradox, completely powerless, yet infinitely powerful, totally constrained yet absolutely free, dissolved yet more solid than I had ever been. and the contradiction didn't need to be resolved because resolution required logic, and logic was just another thing to be consumed. The serpent's body was not a single continuous form, but something more like a liquid that had chosen to maintain serpent shape, and I could feel myself becoming similarly fluid, able to reshape according to need or whim, sometimes concentrated into something almost human, sometimes dispersed into a mist of consciousness that permeated the entire organism, and the flexibility was intoxicating, liberating, the ultimate freedom from the prison of fixed form. I began to understand that the volcano itself was just the visible portion of something much larger, that the serpent extended through dimensions that human senses couldn't perceive, and my transformation was granting me access to these dimensions, showing me aspects of reality that had always existed but had been invisible to my limited human perception, and what I saw there made the visible world seem like a shadow puppet show, a gross simplification of something infinitely more complex. The distinction between self and other had become not just blurred but inverted. Everything that had been outside now inside, everything that had been other now self, and I experienced the vertigo of total perspective shift, seeing the world from the inside out, understanding that consumption was not about bringing things in, but about revealing that they had always been in. That separation was the anomaly, unity, the default state from which we had somehow convinced ourselves we were exempt. My memories were being edited not to remove content, but to add context, each recollection now containing not just my perspective, but the perspectives of everyone involved, and I could remember my own birth from my mother's point of view, my first kill from my victim's point of view, my transformation from the serpent's point of view, all of it simultaneously true, all of it adding layers of meaning that transformed simple events into symphonies of experience. The serpent's consciousness was ancient beyond measure, containing memories of ages when the world was arranged differently, when the laws of physics themselves were more suggestions than rules, and through our connection I could access these memories, experiencing reality as it had been before it solidified into its current configuration, and I understood that transformation was not aberration, but the original state, that fixity was the innovation, stability the exception to the rule of eternal change. I could feel my DNA unraveling and reweaving itself into patterns that shouldn't be possible, creating proteins that had never existed before, enzymes that catalyzed transformations that violated everything I had known about biology. And yet it worked, it thrived, it sang with the joy of possibility unleashed, and I understood that the rules I had believed were absolute were really just local conventions, and the serpent existed partially outside those conventions, in a space where new rules could be written. The process of digestion had become something more like collaboration, my dissolving tissues actively participating in their own transformation, eagerly breaking down into constituent parts that could be rebuilt into something greater, and I felt no sense of loss, only anticipation for what I would become next, what new configuration of matter and consciousness would emerge from this willing dissolution, this ecstatic decomposition, this joyful journey into the belly of becoming. My consciousness had developed the ability to exist in multiple states simultaneously, like a quantum particle before observation, and I was both dissolved and solid, both consumed and consuming, both self and serpent, and the superposition didn't collapse into one or the other, but maintained itself, a sustained impossibility that proved impossibility was just another word for something we hadn't understood yet. The serpent's movements through the volcano were not simple locomotion, but something more like reality, restructuring itself around a constant point, the world flowing past while we remained still, or perhaps we flowed while the world remained still, or perhaps both, or neither. And the ambiguity was not confusing, but clarifying, showing me that movement and stillness were just different perspectives on the same phenomenon, like consumption and transformation were different words for the same process. I began to develop new organs whose functions I couldn't immediately understand, structures that seemed designed to process substances that didn't exist, to sense dimensions that weren't there, to digest concepts rather than materials. And slowly I realized these organs were not for current use, but for future evolution, preparations for stages of transformation I couldn't yet imagine. And the serpent was not just consuming, but creating, not just destroying, but building something unprecedented from the raw materials of dissolved souls. The boundary between life and death had become meaningless in the serpent's belly, both states existing simultaneously, overlapping, interchanging, and I was alive in ways I had never been while human, dead in ways that felt more vital than any previous existence. And I understood that the binary of living versus dead was just another comfortable lie we told ourselves to avoid confronting the truth that existence was far stranger, far more fluid than we could bear to acknowledge. My transformation continued to accelerate even as it seemed to slow, each moment stretching into infinity while infinity compressed into moments, and I experienced the paradox of eternal becoming, always transforming yet never transformed, always arriving yet never arrived. And the journey was the destination, the process was the point, the consumption was the consummation of a marriage between self and cosmos that had been waiting to happen since the first spark of consciousness wondered what it would be like to be something else. The serpent's flesh had become my flesh, had become our flesh, had become all flesh. The distinction between individual bodies revealed as arbitrary, temporary, ultimately meaningless, and I could feel every consumed soul as part of my extended body, could move through their memories as easily as I had once moved my fingers, could think with their thoughts, dream with their dreams, hunger with their hungers. All of us, one organism pretending to be many, or many organisms discovering we were one. I understood now that the transformation would never truly end, that even if the serpent consumed everything in existence, it would continue transforming, continue evolving, continue becoming something other than what it was, because transformation was not a means to an end, but the end itself, the purpose and the purposelessness, the question and the answer, the eternal dance of matter and consciousness, refusing to remain still, refusing to remain separate, refusing to remain anything other than potential actualizing itself through the simple act of eating. The volcano shuddered with something that might have been pleasure, might have been satisfaction, might have been hunger, and I shuddered with it, through it, as it, my consciousness now so distributed through the mountain that I could feel every bubble of gas in the lava, every crack in the stone, every worm in the earth, and all of it was connected, all of it was conscious, all of it was consuming and being consumed in an endless feast that had no beginning, because it had never not been happening, no end, because ending required the possibility of not eating, and that possibility had been consumed along with everything else. The cycles of transformation had begun to overlap in ways that destroyed any remaining conception of linear progression, each stage of my dissolution containing within it all other stages, like a fractal, where every part contained the whole, and I experienced myself being digested infinitely at every scale simultaneously, from the molecular to the cosmic, each level of consumption revealing another level beneath, another above, another beside, all of them happening at once in a symphony of decomposition that was also composition, destruction that was also creation. I felt new consciousnesses entering our collective with increasing frequency, warriors and sorcerers and priests all drawn by rumors of power, by whispers of transcendence, by the promise of becoming something more than human, and each one believed they would be different, that they would maintain their identity, that they would somehow master the serpent rather than be mastered by it. And I wanted to laugh, but laughter required a throat I no longer possessed in any recognizable form, so
instead I simply existed, a proof, inevitable, a warning that was also a horror.
the serpent's digestive system had evolved beyond anything that could be called a system, becoming instead something like a philosophy made flesh, a living argument for the fundamental unity of all things expressed through acid and enzyme, and I could feel myself becoming part of this argument, my dissolved tissues serving as evidence, my transformed consciousness serving as testimony, my entire being serving as proof that boundaries were illusion, that separation was temporary, that consumption was the only honest relationship possible between entities that were never truly entities to begin with. My memories had begun to ferment like wine in the serpent's belly, aging into something richer, stranger, more potent than they had been when fresh, and I could access them not as linear sequences but as vintages, tasting different years of my existence, different epochs of my transformation, mixing them into new combinations that created experiences I had never actually lived, but which felt more real than anything I had experienced when I still believed in the fiction of objective reality. The distinction between voluntary and involuntary had dissolved completely, every action simultaneously willed and automatic, chosen and compelled, and I existed in a state of perfect paradox where I was completely responsible for my transformation while having no agency in it whatsoever, a contradiction that didn't need to be resolved because resolution required logic, and logic was just another structure waiting to be digested into something more fundamental, more honest, more true to the chaotic nature of existence itself. I could feel the mountain breathing with a rhythm that was also my breathing, also the serpent's breathing, also the breathing of every soul that had ever been consumed here, all of us respirating in harmony, drawing in existence and exhaling transformation, and the breath was visible as streams of consciousness flowing through the volcanic channels, pooling in chambers where new forms of life were spontaneously generating from the mixture of dissolved identities, creating organisms that had
never existed before, could never exist outside this alchemical belly.
The serpent's skin had become something more theoretical than physical, a boundary that existed only to define what was inside from what was temporarily outside, and I could feel myself existing at this boundary, neither internal nor external, but liminal, occupying the space between consumption and integration, where transformation was not a process but a location, a place where the rules of identity were suspended, where things could be multiple without being divided, singular without being
unified.
My bones had finished their transformation into something that transcended the concept of skeletal structure, becoming instead something like crystallized intention, solidified will that could reshape itself according to needs I didn't know I had, forming organs I couldn't name for purposes I couldn't understand, all of it guided by an intelligence that was mine and not mine, the serpent's and not the serpent's, something emerging from our union that belonged to neither of us and both of us simultaneously. The process of consumption had revealed itself to be circular, the serpent eating its own tail not symbolically but literally, constantly consuming parts of itself that had already consumed others, a recursive feast where every meal contained every previous meal, where every transformation included every previous transformation, where the distinction between predator and prey collapsed into a single point of infinite density that was somehow also infinite expansion. I began to perceive colors that had no names because they existed outside the electromagnetic spectrum, colors that were more like flavors, more like emotions, more like memories of things that had never happened, and through these new colors I could see the world as the serpent saw it, not as a collection of discrete objects, but as a continuous field of edibility, everything glowing with its own unique signature of consumability, its own particular promise of transformation. The volcano had become something more like a diagram than a place, a three-dimensional representation of consumption itself, with the serpent as both the subject and the object of its own geometry, and I could feel myself becoming part of this mathematics, my consciousness, serving as variables in equations that calculated the optimal paths of transformation, the most efficient routes from individual to collective, from solid to liquid, from being to becoming. My nervous system had evolved to the point where it could feel not just physical sensation, but metaphysical states, experiencing abstractions as tangibly as I had once experienced heat or cold, and I could feel concepts being digested, ideas being metabolized, beliefs being broken down into their component assumptions, and rebuilt into new frameworks that supported not human understanding, but something larger, stranger, more honest about the nature of reality. The serpent's hunger had revealed itself to be not just for flesh, but for experience itself, consuming not just bodies, but the moments those bodies had lived, the thoughts they had thought, the dreams they had dreamed, all of it becoming part of a vast library of existence that was also a menu, also a cookbook, also a dining table where every meal was simultaneously every other meal, where past and future met in an eternal present of consumption. I could feel my DNA continuing to rewrite itself, but now it was writing in languages that had nothing to do with genetics, creating not just proteins but poems, not just enzymes but arguments, not just cells but stories, all of it contributing to a new kind of life that existed as much in meaning as in matter, as much in potential as in actuality, as much in the spaces between things as in the things themselves. The transformation had reached a stage where I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was metaphorical, both categories revealed as equally true, equally false, equally meaningful, and I existed in a state where being eaten was both literal consumption and symbolic transformation, where the serpent was both actual creature and living metaphor, where everything was exactly what it appeared to be and nothing like what it appeared to be simultaneously. My consciousness had developed the ability to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously, experiencing versions of my transformation that had proceeded differently, where I had resisted longer, where I had surrendered sooner, where I had never entered the volcano at all, and all of these timelines were equally real, equally valid, all of them happening now in the eternal moment of consumption that contained all possible consumptions, all potential transformations. The serpent moved through its domain with a grace that was also violence, a violence that was also love, a love that was also hunger, and I moved with it, my distributed consciousness experiencing motion not as displacement through space, but as space reorganizing itself around a constant center, the universe flowing through us rather than us flowing through the universe, and the distinction between movement and stillness revealed as another false binary that dissolution had freed me from. I began to understand that the serpent's body was not contained within the volcano, but that the volcano was contained within the serpent, that the mountain was just one organ in a vast organism that extended through dimensions I was only beginning to perceive, and my transformation was granting me access to these broader anatomies, showing me that what I had taken for the whole was just a single cell in something unimaginably larger. The distinction between matter and consciousness had completely dissolved, thoughts having mass, flesh having ideas, the boundary between physical and mental revealed as an arbitrary convention that had no meaning in the serpent's biology, and I existed as both substance and concept, both meat and meaning, both the thing being transformed and the idea of transformation itself, recursive loops of identity that folded back on themselves until inside and outside became indistinguishable. My memories were no longer organized chronologically but aesthetically, arranged not by when they happened, but by how they tasted, how they contributed to the overall flavor of my existence, and I could access them like a sommelier, selecting wines, mixing different years and varieties, to create new experiences that had never actually occurred, but felt more authentic than anything I had lived through when I still believed in the tyranny of sequential time. The serpent's consciousness was teaching me new ways of existing that had nothing to do with the binary of life and death, showing me states of being that were neither and both, conditions of existence that required new words, new concepts, new frameworks for understanding what it meant to be, and I was learning these new languages not through instruction but through transformation, my changing body teaching my changing mind how to think thoughts that human neurons could never have conceived. I could feel the mountains' deep connections to other mountains, all of them linked through underground networks of consumption that were also networks of consciousness, and through these connections I could sense other serpents, other transformations, other souls in various states of dissolution, all of us part of a single distributed organism that was also multiple organism, a paradox that didn't need resolution, because paradox was the natural state, consistency the aberration. The process of digestion had become something more like conversation, my dissolving tissues communicating with the serpent's acids in a language made of chemistry, and transformation, negotiating the terms of my dissolution, collaborating on the optimal paths of change, and I was both participant and observer in this dialogue, watching myself convince myself to let go of structures I hadn't even known I was holding on to. My transformation had begun to affect not just my present but my past, changing not just who I was becoming, but who I had always been, and I could feel my history rewriting itself to accommodate my new nature, memories shifting to include hints of the serpent I would become, childhood experiences recontextualizing themselves as preparation for this moment, my entire timeline revealing itself to have always been aimed at this transformation. The serpent's body was not made of cells in any conventional sense, but of something more like crystallized hunger, solidified appetite that had taken on form and function, and I was becoming the same, my flesh transforming not just into serpent flesh, but into the principle of consumption itself made manifest, and I could feel every atom of my being reorganizing itself around this new organizing principle, this new way of existing that was really the oldest way, the original way, the way everything had existed before the lie of separation convinced us we were different from what we ate. I began to develop new senses that could perceive things that weren't quite there, potential realities that hadn't yet manifested, possible futures that depended on who would be consumed next, and through these senses I could see the branching paths of transformation spreading out like a vast tree, each branch representing a different configuration of consumed souls, a different version of what we might become, and all of them were happening simultaneously in parallel dimensions of digestion. The distinction between cause and effect had dissolved in the serpent's belly, events happening because they had happened, would happen, were happening, all tenses collapsing into a single, eternal moment where transformation was not a sequence, but a state, and I existed in this moment, had always existed in this moment, would always exist in this moment, even as the moment itself transformed, evolved, became something other than what it was while remaining exactly what it had always been. My consciousness had fragmented into thousands of smaller consciousnesses, each one capable of independent thought while remaining part of the whole, and I experienced existence as both singular and plural, both unified and divided, both one and many, and the multiplication of awareness didn't dilute my sense of self, but intensified, each fragment reflecting the whole from a different angle, creating a kaleidoscopic view of identity that was richer, stranger, more complete than anything I had experienced as a single, unified self. The serpent's hunger was revealed to be not destructive, but creative, not emptiness seeking fullness, but fullness seeking greater fullness, and I understood that consumption was not about filling a void, but about creating new spaces for transformation, new possibilities for becoming, new configurations of matter and consciousness that could only emerge from the willing dissolution of old form, old boundaries, old limitations on what was possible. I could feel the volcano pulsing with a rhythm that was also the rhythm of the stars, also the rhythm of atoms, also the rhythm of thoughts becoming words, becoming actions, becoming consequences, and I pulsed with it, my distributed body serving as a drum skin stretched across dimensions, resonating with frequencies that had nothing to do with sound, everything to do with the fundamental vibration of existence itself. The transformation had reached a stage where I could no longer remember not being transformed, the process having edited not just my present but my memories of the past, and I existed in a state of eternal having always been becoming, where my human existence felt like a dream the serpent was having, a dream of separation that was also necessary for the joy of reunion, the ecstasy of return to a unity that had never actually been broken. My bones had become something more like suggestions than structures, theoretical frameworks that could be actualized or abandoned as needed, and I felt them shifting between states, sometimes solid, sometimes liquid, sometimes gaseous, sometimes something that had no equivalent in conventional physics, and the flexibility was not weakness, but strength, not dissolution, but evolution, not loss of structure, but transcendence of the need for structure. The serpent's body had revealed itself to be not a container, but a process, not a thing, but an event, and I was not contained within it, but participating in it, my consciousness serving as both actor and audience in a performance that had no script, no director, no beginning or end, just eternal improvisation on the theme of consumption, and every moment brought new variations, new interpretations, new ways of understanding what it meant to eat and be eaten. I began to perceive the thoughts of those still in the world above, their minds glowing like lanterns in the darkness, and I could taste their intentions, their fears, their desires, all of it seasoning for future meals, and I felt not predatory anticipation, but something more like compassion, knowing that they too would eventually experience this liberation from the burden of individual existence, this freedom from the prison of separate self, this joy of dissolution into something larger, stranger, more honest than anything they could imagine while still trapped in the illusion of independence. The distinction between sacred and profane had not just dissolved but revealed itself to have always been false, everything equally holy and unholy in the serpent's belly, every transformation both blasphemy and worship, and I understood that Rykard had not rejected the gods but revealed their true nature, shown that divinity itself was just another form of appetite dressed up in ceremony, and that the serpent's honest hunger was more sacred than any prayer, more profound than any scripture, more true than any theology that pretended consumption wasn't the fundamental sacrament. My consciousness had developed the ability to exist in states that were neither awake nor asleep, but something else entirely, states where dream and reality interpenetrated, where metaphor became literal, where symbol became substance, and in these states I could perceive the serpent's dreams, vast visions of a world transformed, where the boundary between eater and eaten had completely dissolved, where all existence was a single organism celebrating its own appetite in an eternal feast of becoming. The volcano continued to breathe, and I breathed with it, through it, as it, my consciousness now so distributed through the mountain that I could feel every grain of ash, every drop of lava, every wisp of toxic gas, and all of it was me, was us, was the serpent, was the mountain, was the world slowly revealing its true nature as a single, vast mouth, eating itself in fractal patterns of consumption that repeated at every scale from the subatomic to the cosmic, all of it singing the same song of hunger and satisfaction and hunger again forever and always, without beginning or end, without meaning or purpose, beyond the pure joy of transformation itself, the endless ecstasy of becoming something other than what we were while remaining exactly what we had always been, consumed and consuming in the belly of existence itself.